The streets of New York City are dark and damp, but inside St. Peter's Lutheran Church, something lively is happening. The Jazz Vespers, held every Sunday for 17 years, is underway, featuring Eddie Bonnemere, a Roman Catholic layman, music teacher, and renowned jazz composer and musician.
Suffer the little children to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of heaven. Suffer the little children to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of heaven.
Welcome to Perspectives. This week, Roy Lloyd of the Lutheran Church in America will be investigating the topic of jazz in the church. His guest is John Garcia Gensel, pastor to the jazz community, St. Peter's Lutheran Church, New York. Joining in the discussion will be Ted Baer of the Episcopal Church, Patricia McClurg of the Presbyterian Church in the U.S., and Sister Pat O'Sullivan of the Grey Nuns of the Sacred Heart. Now your host, Roy Lloyd.
The word jazz probably brings some interesting images to our minds. For some, jazz is something which belongs in clubs and theaters. For some others, jazz has an additional aspect, a religious one. To those brought up on a diet of Bach chorales and Wesley hymns, jazz and the church just don't seem like a proper mix. To our guest today, expressing faith in the jazz idiom seems natural and logical. John Gensel has spent more than 2 decades as a pastor to those in the jazz community, not to promote himself or get publicity, but to minister to real people who happen to make their livings with trumpets and drums rather than adding machines and steel ingots. John, let's get right down to it. Isn't jazz in the church too secular?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Of course it's too secular. The incarnation is too much of an incarnation. It's too secular from the viewpoint of the concept that we have of the sacred is over against the secular when they should really be together. So it is, because the people in the church oftentimes have boxed in God and think that unless something is this particular way, it's no good at all. So it is too secular. Now what does that mean? I mean,
where do we get our images of what is sacred and secular?
Well, I think we get it from the viewpoint of our own particular background. If we're raised or reared in a certain way, we begin to think that our style of doing things, or the way that we think, or our particular training becomes sacred. That's the way that God wants it, because we've been trained that way. And generally speaking, from the church's viewpoint, we don't say that this is only one way in which we're looking at God, but this is the way. And when that happens, we get conditioned, and pretty soon anything that differs by look or by sound from what we think has become sacred then is no good, and then becomes evil. And the bottom line to it all is that when we think that it becomes dangerous, and then heresy sets in, and we begin to do all sorts of things that are terrible to one another.
Let's push this a little bit further. I mean,
Okay,
how could
Ted.
jazz possibly be anything but jazz? How could any art be Christian? Because Christian is a noun, not an adjective. You can't have Christian art. It doesn't stand there.
Oh, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's what you bring to it. One time years ago, we had a workshop down at the Village Gate in New York City. And Billy Strayhorn, who was Duke Ellington's right-hand man for many, many, many years, said, you know, there are 88 keys, and there they are. They're neither sacred nor secular. I think what is sacred or secular, it depends what you do to it. An airplane, you know, the old thing, can be used to bring medicine to the needy and the poor and the ones who are not in health, or it can bring bombs. So it depends what you bring to it. I think that's very, very, very important. And the thing that I just keep stressing is the fact that we must be very, very careful that we do not impose our particular concept about architecture, about music, about theology on someone else and say that this is what God has given me and that's the only way to do it. And we do this constantly. We can't help it. We're built that way. And we certainly do it with music, you know. And we have to grow up. And a lot of in reference to jazz in the church specifically, is the fact that we have been raised, particularly in the Lutheran Church, from a Northern European perspective, not an Afro-American.
But you're not Northern European, right?
No, I'm from Puerto Rico, you know, although I've been reared and I've lived in the United States for the last 59 years, so I'm very much a continental Puerto Rican, and some of my Puerto Rican brethren say, you're not Puerto Rican, you know. So it depends a great deal. It's from whence comest thou, you know, and what is your particular orientation. And that's one of the reasons why we don't accept jazz in church, or many people do not, because our general public in all sections of the country have not been taught American classical music, which is jazz. We have been taught European classical music. And although most of us do not say that we're influenced by the Europeans, for instance, now if you want to go to the best medical schools, you don't go to Europe as you used to. Or if you want to go to the best schools in reference to being a chef in the Waldorf Astoria or whatever place, you don't go to Europe. We have the best ones here in the United States. And we have not yet grown up theologically and musically. We're still, at least the Lutherans, hanging on to Northern European. Not that it isn't good and not that the chorales aren't wonderful, but we're based upon that because the Germans and the Swedes, that's where it comes from. And until we begin to grow up in our own culture, American culture, then we're still going to look at this thing as something that's foreign and something that has the beat and rhythm, you know, is wrong because I guess God is not very rhythmical, or he's tone deaf, or he doesn't know what the dickens is going on. Now, he did it all, you know.
Let me push that back a little bit further.
Okay,
I mean, the music itself or the artwork itself is clearly not neither Christian nor non-Christian because it's not making a profession of faith, as I said, but the musician or the artist can be Christian or non-Christian. And isn't your ministry to the artist, to the person?
Ted, you're absolutely right. And I really wanted Patricia or Pat to say this because I think that they should come first. You know, I'm really not very chauvinistic, and I know that some
Why
of
don't you ask them the question, and then they can answer it?
Yeah, will you ask me, please, you know, how I got started in all of this?
How did you get started in all of this?
Patricia, I'm going to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank
Some of the women are going to get angry with me.
Yeah.
But, well, actually, I think that's very, very important because this whole thing started out as a pastoral ministry. It wasn't that I wanted to jazz up the church, or it wasn't that I didn't think that the great dramatic mass or the 11 o'clock service, which I think is absolutely fantastic and has all great possibilities of being very dramatic and expansive, as we do it at St. Peter's Church. It wasn't that I wanted to spoil that or to jazz it up, but what happened was that I went to a jazz club and loving jazz. In fact, I heard Duke Ellington way back in 1933. I had a musician come to me and he said, I have a problem, may I speak with you? I said, of course. And we talked about it. And pretty soon the word got around that there was a preacher in New York City that was making the scene. And I would get telephone calls saying, I'm the wife of a jazz musician, you don't know who I am. But I said, well, I know your husband. He said, may I speak with you? So it's very essential that I stress here that what happened was that somebody had a need out here objectively. And I, as a subject, responded to that need. And that's when things happen. Most of the needs in the world, we don't respond to more than just simply thinking about it or saying, no, isn't it terrible that there was this automobile accident or this airplane crash or whatever. But we neither have the money, the time, nor the ability to do anything about it. It's a statistic. But when something hits us on a very personal relationship, where the need is here, and I, in my case, feel a need to do something, that's the way it happened. So it's a pastoral ministry primarily. And then I got into the music. That is, I got there by the music, but in reference to the ministry, it was serving the needs of the church. I'll never forget, after I was involved for about a year or two, two musicians came to me, and they said, John, we want to apologize to you. And I said, gee, for what? They said, well, you know, when you first got into this ministry, we thought that you got into it to get to know us, and then when you would have something at the church, you would have us play for a benefit, and you wouldn't have to pay us. I said, no. I said, the Lutheran Church is spending a lot of money having me out here on the streets to serve you. This is a servant ministry. I'm your servant, and we want to fulfill your needs, and that's what the Lord wants me to do.
A lot of people are being served in your church. Let me call time just at this point so that we can see a little bit more of the people in your church. We saw some of the congregation of St. Peter's Lutheran Church in New York City at the beginning of the program. Let's get a fuller flavor of the Jazz Vespers and meet John Gensel's close friend and colleague, Eddie Bonamere, who's a great example of the purpose of the jazz ministry at John's church.
1, 2, ready, go. Lord. You know, hold on. You're so cute. You know, did you hear what I'm hearing up here? Lord, make me an instrument. Lord, you know, what is this? Look, show some, you know, that you're alive. Like, Lord, make me an instrument. You're asking the Lord for something, isn't it? Lord, make... Come on, let's go. Ladies, 1, 2, ready, go. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. 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 Together now, everyone. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. We have to stop being, we're on stage all the time. In time we have to be really relaxed. Because you can't sing when you're stiff. You got to really let out, you know. They say let it all hang out, whatever that means. But I feel that whenever I play or whenever I sing, my first job is to communicate to those people in the pew and get them alive and moving. Otherwise, I've lost them. And I've learned that because I was, as a jazz musician and also as a musician who played for dances, you haven't got time to, on the second tune, to get the people out on the floor. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. He doesn't care about the color of your skin or what religion you've been in. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. Help me, Jesus. Help me, Jesus. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. Help me, Jesus. Help me, Jesus. Help me, Jesus.
May I say something here?
Please, John.
Now, many jazz musicians would say, well, that's fine, but that isn't jazz at all. Now, there was very little jazz in there. It was very predictable and so on. And I just simply want to say that at Jazz Vespers, we have different musicians play at different times. And sometimes it's extremely progressive jazz. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's New Orleans jazz, sometimes what we call mainstream jazz or cool jazz, where the musicians can blow as they please. So that, unfortunately, we don't have the time, but I would love that if we would have various segments of services that are absolutely very different, so that it's not always singable. And many, many, many services, the only words that are spoken or said is a hymn that we sing where Paul Knopf plays jazz interludes between the stanzas, and the rest is in the prayer or the scriptures or the sermon. And the rest is simply instrumental music, which opens up a whole new thing. How can you get any sense of worship from instrumental music and so on? So I wanted to say that because I don't think it would be fair to say this, because a lot of jazz musicians say, well, baby, you know, that's not the way I play jazz.
John, are all of your services with jazz music?
Yes, with very, very, very few exceptions. The second service that I had, I think, in reference to Jazz Vespers, which was in October of 1965, mm-hmm. way back then we began it, was a person who played a cello. And my little son at that time, he's not little now, said, what are we doing with that non-church music here? Mm-hmm. Because church music to him was jazz. And when he went to a regular service and heard what we ordinarily think is church music, that wasn't church music because he was used to hearing jazz in church.
I think what Pat was saying was you were asking, are all the services with jazz? And I think the answer is no. We're talking about you have a regular
Oh, you mean in the rest of the church?
Oh, well, see, what I'm concerned about is, are there, as a pastor, aren't there people who might feel excluded because they might not be musicians or they might not be into jazz?
Oh, yeah. Well, we have 3 services on Sunday morning, 8:45, 11, the Mass, the Orthodox. Well, I don't think that's as Orthodox as jazz service, but, and then the 5 o'clock service. Mm-hmm. So it's not a matter of exclusion, it's a matter of opening up the opportunity to have people come to what they wish to have, instead of just having steak only and fish You have a variety, and you can come to what you wish. It's not a matter of exclusion. It's a matter of offering a variety so that more people can come to what they want to come to.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Some people say that music is a universal language. Is that true?
Of course it isn't true.
It is not true.
No, naturally it isn't. You all know that.
I was just thinking, you know, New Orleans jazz is my kind of jazz, and so that's not universal for everybody.
Well, no, music isn't at all, because, for instance, if you had Chinese music to worship in, nobody would relate to it. Music is very parochial, very ethnic. The ragas of India, the Greek music, I don't know what kind of music Jesus sang before he went out to the Garden of Gethsemane. They sang a hymn. Maybe it was the blues. Maybe it was closer to the blues than anything that we certainly have with Northern European music, you know, the chorales and so on. But no, it is not. And that's a very important point. And one of the reasons that we do not accept jazz in church is simply that we haven't had it. And we don't relate to it because we have been weaned on something else. And what is strange is fearful. A child going to school for the first year at kindergarten and all is very frightened. Why? Because the people look different? Of course not. These are the people who live next door. But because they're going into a new environment, they're getting out of the nursery, they're going to something strange, they're frightened. And so therefore, because we're not accustomed to jazz, jazz is not a universal music. It's played universally, but it's an ethnic group, and people relate to the music in which they have been raised. For instance, when you say to somebody, well, that isn't sacred music. Now, if I'm speaking to a Lutheran, to a Roman Catholic, to an Episcopalian, they know what I'm talking about, because the music is very much the same in Methodist or whatever it may be. But to the Pentecostals, or to some left-hand, piano going and all, that's sacred music too, and you couldn't get anything more opposite in sound-wise than that kind of a sound in a worship service. So what is poison to someone isn't, and Paul talked about this.
To underline that, exactly, Paul talked about it. The Bible uses all kinds of music, from the sublime to the totally absurd, and it's sacred if it's offered up to God, and it's not sacred if it's offered up to anything else.
It has to do with the text to a great extent, And, well, you say, well, what about when somebody just comes in there and blows in the service and is playing, well, he didn't, or he needn't, which is a Thelonious Monk tune and so forth, it has nothing to do with anything. And it brings up the whole thing of, what about the musicians who play? Aren't they there just for a showcase, or aren't they there just for entertainment and so forth? Well, I suspect that some of them are. Some could care less. And incidentally, if I may say something that's really sacrilegious, I suspect that sometimes choir members could care less.
I would guess.
And what they're thinking about is not how I love Jesus so much, but how are they singing? The organist, for instance, who's playing on an orchestra, and the reason we have the organ in the church is because he uses all instruments, trumpet and flutes and everything, which indicates that we want a variety in the church. And the point is that when that particular person is playing, he's playing a variety and not just one thing. And what the organist is thinking about is, am I playing the right note? Am I articulating? Just as I'm speaking now, I want to be sure that the people who are listening and looking in can understand my words. They say, well, Gensel, you're concerned about how you're speaking. You're darn right I am. I'm not thinking about worship at the moment, because I want to get my message across. And when that preacher's up there, baby, whether it's Billy Graham or the Pope or whoever it is, he wants to make sure, and when the Pope comes to all the various, he speaks in the native language.
John,
why? Because he thinks...
I want to move you on one more point.
Okay.
Now,
I am moved,
I know you're moved,
yeah.
and I love it.
Yeah, well,
and I love the music. Now, I grew up in New York. I know Thelonious Monk. I knew him. He died recently.
Yes, we had his funeral 3.5 hours.
Ornette Coleman quite well. A lot of jazz musicians, and I used to play the bass when I was back in college, and et cetera. I knew a lot of jazz musicians in New York, and a lot of them are not only not sacred, but a lot of them are trapped by drug addiction. A lot of them are trapped by witchcraft. There's a new group that's expounding their witchcraft, etc. A lot of them are suffering from very deep problems and have very tough lifestyles, living on a marginal existence, just trying to carry out their. How do you minister to these people? How do you present the gospel to these people? And you've opened them up, you've brought them into the church, and you've given them beautiful music, the music that they can relate to. But now, how do you deal with their needs?
I deal with their needs the same way that I deal with most people's needs, because the needs of the jazz musician, the needs of the people who are regular members of the church, if we can say that word, which is ridiculous. In fact, I may just bring it up to your attention this way. Years ago, the people in the church said to me, "Gee, John, I'm glad you're out there with those people. How are they? What do they think, these jazz musicians?" Well, I say they're worried about where they're living, where their children are going to church, whether they have enough money to live on, and who their neighbors are, and so forth. And then the jazz musicians say, "Hey, how do you relate to those people in the church there, you know, if they didn't happen to be..." I said, "What do they think about?" "Well, they're concerned about where their children go to school and where they live." In other words, we're human beings and we have basically the same needs. We may have different styles and we may be night people as well as day people. So I deal with them exactly the same. And the interesting thing about it is that many, many jazz musicians had their orientation in the church. And one of the reasons that many don't go to the institutionalized church is because their music was spoken about as devil music. It's from the bordellos, in the bordellos of New Orleans and so forth. It had to do with devil music and so forth. And they were turned off by the church because so often the church is thinking about style, about their own particular brand of theology, about the neighborhood, rather than human beings. I wish I had time to go into so many things, but once we had we had a tap dancing situation. We used the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes. And the 2 tap dancers said, "John, if we dance here, the pews have an obstruction here. They won't be able to see our feet." And I said, "I'll tell you what we'll do." This was in the old St. Peter's Church. I said, "I'll invite the people to sit up in the chancel." Now, you know, in a Mennonite church you can do that, but not where there's sacred places up in the Lutheran church. And so the kids brought up the kneeling pads and sat there, and people sat actually on the altar rail, and we had a wonderful tap dance. And at the end I said, "Now some of you people thought that we were being very sacrilegious to invite you up, you know, in the Holy of Holies, beyond the altar rail and so forth. But I want you to know that you have made this place sacred, because it's not the altar of wood, it's not the cross that Jesus died for. He died for human beings. And wherever human beings are present and are worshiping Him, then that spot becomes sacred. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy? Yes. But you break the Sabbath law if it's for a human being. And so I thank those people for making, on that particular Sunday afternoon, that area sacred. Why? Because they're human beings, and that's why Jesus died. And that's the important thing. And the needs of the jazz musicians are the... one time I had a reporter that wanted to really hook me on drug addiction in the jazz world. And I said, "Look, I want to be honest with you. There are only 2 groups that I know well, jazz musicians and ministers. And I can tell you that there are more jazz musicians on drugs than ministers. And beyond that, I can't say anything, though I don't know anything about anybody else. I know that, but it's a general malady rather than a specific thing."
John,
I wish we had more time. We could talk
here.
about that for a long time.
I know, being a pioneer in this field, John, with jazz ministry, that you must have had to withstand some flack.
Oh, my goodness.
Would you kindly tell us how you handled that?
Well, you know, minorities live on flack. You know, we love it. After a while, we protest about it, but if you're a Puerto Rican or black, you kind of take it, you know, onto yourself and say, "Hey, somebody isn't protesting lately about me." Well, I remember one time we did a jazz with Howard McGee in Williamsport and in Mansfield, Pennsylvania. We did the same service in Mansfield, Pennsylvania, State Teachers College. We did it in Williamsport in a church. And somebody who was evidently a literalist and a fundamentalist up in Mansfield, Ohio, wrote me a letter. "Devil music, you're desecrating the church," and so on. The same service, we had a doctor respond to it at Williamsport. He says, "Man," he says, "I'm coming back to the church. If you can have such music, it touches my heart and my deepest emotions of sorrow and gladness, I'm going to come back to the church." So you have different reactions from different people. Sure, I've gotten a lot of letters, and I haven't been threatened or anything like that, you know, but there's been a lot of resistance. Again, depending upon the orientation of a person and what is meaningful to the person. If you're familiar with something and it touches your heartstrings, then it's good. And if it doesn't, it's strange and you could care less for it. And we have this devilish thinking that we know the mind of God, and we like to put God in a box, and He's a Lutheran, or He's a Presbyterian, or He's a Methodist. He certainly isn't a Baptist, I know that. But, you know...
I'm here to protest.
I'll protest for it.
Ted, you know, in I think it's John 3, the Holy Spirit bloweth where it listeth, which means it blows where it wants to. But I think of a list as something that's turned like a ship, listeth. And the Holy Spirit blows in different places, not only upright. I remember when I first started the jazz ministry, I used to turn the table in the old parish house around at askew. Somebody says, "Hey, the altar is cockeyed." I said, "Yes? So what?" Well, it's not at right angles. I said, is there anything in the Bible that says that the altar should be at right angles? And for the first time, he began to think about the altar. If it's always the same way, you don't cook the same way all the time, you don't cook potatoes, you don't make love the same way, I hope not, all the time, there has to be a variety. And in our hymn book, it says, in our new green hymnals that we just came out, it says that there are a variety of styles, and we must be very careful of trying to make our specific concept, our lack of knowledge, or if we think we have a lot of knowledge, to think that it's universal, any more than, you know, than music is universal.
John, tell me a little bit about the man who comes in and helps you, the man we saw on the tape who was...
Oh, Eddie Bonamere is a Roman Catholic. He's been teaching in the public school system for about 25 years. I consider him to be really the greatest contemporary writer of contemporary church music. He's a remarkable person. He's a wonderful choral director, a marvelous, you didn't hear him play the piano, marvelous pianist, very warm, and has a great ability to teach with the kids. He was at Purdue University some time ago with a youth conference and had, I don't know, a couple thousand kids just hanging on their seats. He's a remarkable person. And now he has the first Jazz Vespers of every month. Why? Well, because it's the closest thing to the liturgy of the church. He has taken the liturgy of the church and put his own melodic line to it. You know, the Sanctus and the Glory and so on. And so people who are not familiar with more or less jazz to a certain extent can come and relate to it. And it's a good way in which to get them orientated so they at least go away thinking, hey, there's something here. We did have a great freedom in this service, and we did bend a note or two, and he even played some Duke Ellington melodies and so on. And so they can relate to it, and that's so very important. If I were simply to have way progressive jazz where the guy's going to blow up there for 40 minutes with cascades of sounds rather than having some sort of a melodic line, they would say, my goodness, I'm turned away from that. That's terrible. And we've had that kind, that sort of music, which I think is tremendous at times, and I've had people walk out because they say, well, if this is what it's about. So there is, in a sense, a little commercial aspect to it from the viewpoint of wanting to lead the people so that they're just not turned away in this new strange music, but have a feeling that they can relate to it somehow.
Do you get many jazz musicians in your church?
Not too many, unless they play. Jazz musicians for the most part don't go to church, you know, they for whatever reasons. But we do get a number that do come.
But you're still reaching out to them in Soho.
Oh, definitely. Mine mostly is a pastoral ministry, and I have the privilege of being with them on many. I could spend my entire day from 9 o'clock in the morning to midnight just counseling.
Well, if you see Ornette Coleman, give him...
I saw him the other day. He did a wonderful concert with Ed Summerlin. We could talk about Ed Summerlin from London Methodist, who did one of the first things in church worship down in
John,
Texas. When
I must call time.
Come on, I'm just starting.
God loves us when we work,
haven't even,
but God loves us when we sing. Thank you for being with us.
See you in church. Bye.
We hope that you have enjoyed Perspectives, which has been brought to you by the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church in America, the Presbyterian Church in the U.S., and the United Methodist Church, in cooperation with the Protestant Radio and Television Center. If you would like a transcript of the program you have just seen, please send $3 with your name and address to Perspectives, 1727 Clifton Road, Northeast, Atlanta, Georgia, 30329. We thank you for being with us and hope you will join us next week for Perspectives.